English Tudor Queen Anne Boleyn, Greek folk hero Achilles, Queen of Egypt Cleopatra, an 11th century Denmark Viking, colorblind casting, reimagined history, soft revisionism, fantasy wonderlands of racial utopia, black characters and egalitarian alternative realities, shows and films, not so much ignoring the races of the actors they're casting, as redacting the existence of racism, projecting contemporary notions of race backwards in time onto societies that didn't share them. A director unabashedly saying a new Star Wars project will be from her own queer point of view. Actors wishing to see themselves represented in roles irrespective of whether it clashes with context, canon, or the writer's vision. People preoccupied with seeing a classic property through the lens of their disability, or queerness, or gender, or race. And many of these reimagined shows and films crashing and burning at the box office, or in the ratings, because identity and representation has been disproportionately forefronted over originality or merit. This is the modern era of identity junkies. Much of what you do isn't inherently liberal at all. You're boring, and in leeching off existing properties, and being derivative and co-opting and strip mining what's come before, you're being creatively reactionary, no matter how much of a progressive patterner you put on the lame content you produce. Liberalism is about imagining the future. The last thing it should be about is reimagining the past. How best to succinctly express my feelings about it all?
Yeah, bullshit! Bullshit!
Not bad, but not quite doing it.
You're the fucking problem, you fucking Dr. White onkin jamrag arkin spunk bubble.
Closer, but still not quite there.
Take a big step back and literally fuck your own face!
Almost there, but I'm not quite over the edge.
Twat waffle!
That's it. Why shouldn't Cleopatra be a melanated sister? Pondered Tina Goravi, the director of the panned series African Queens. And why do some people need Cleopatra to be white? For some Egyptians it seems to really matter. She shouldn't be a melanated sister because she wasn't a melanated sister. Cleopatra was Macedonian Greek, and if the Egyptians feel aggrieved, well, they're the Egyptians, the people from the place where the things happened with the person in your show. So it wouldn't be crazy to take their views and perceptions into account rather than cavalierly discount them, as tends to occur with identity junkies.
What?
Troy, Fall of a City features a black Achilles. The Guardian wheeled in a professor of Greek culture to try and lend some credence to this injudiciously indulgent attempt at representation. This is the real issue here. Anyone who says it's inauthentic to cast Achilles as black has to explain why it's authentic to use an Australian actor speaking in English to represent an ancient Greek hero. That seems to me another powerful form of appropriation and an equally misleading depiction. No, it's not a powerful form of appropriation to have a white dude from Sydney play an ancient, more or less white dude from ancient Greece. And to say it's an equally misleading depiction is a fatuous, cringy, false equivalency. A few years back, a dark-skinned man was present in a BBC cartoon for children about life in Roman Britain. Critics raised objections on the theme of whether dark skin was typical, The Guardian wrote, enclosing the word in all the grumpily incredulous quotation marks it could muster up. Whether or not this cartoon family was exceptional is beside the point, The Guardian maundered on. Roman Britain was indeed a multi-ethnic society, it said, before pressing in a Dr. Nichols. The internet discussion was particularly prompted by the appearance of a black Roman soldier in the detachment building Hadrian's Wall. But in fact, there is an ancient account of precisely this. The Emperor Septimus Severus was inspecting his troops on the wall when one of the garrison's well-known jokers, an Ethiopian, offered him a garland. All this is fine, but what the BBC, The Guardian, and others left out was the reality that while some of these soldiers and other personnel in these garrisons were brought from near and far, they were there transiently, sort of like tens of thousands of Bangladeshi cheap labor sweating to fling up vainglorious infrastructure projects in Abu Dhabi or football stadiums in Qatar, and didn't really put down roots, and certainly didn't enter into progressive mixed marriages and settle down as enlightened patriarchs of harmonious mixed-race households. The British were in India for 2 centuries or so, but there were virtually zero ethnic and genetic commingling. The setup as depicted in the cartoon was an exceptionally minor scenario they chose, through practical inclination, to pluck out in forefront, because they're identity junkies.
You just don't want to learn anything. You just don't want to listen to anybody.
The BBC stuck to its progressive guns, however, and later produced this almost unlistenable doctrinaire ditty about black people featuring prominently throughout British history.
Please lend me your ears for this news I shall impart. May not have been told, we have been here from the start.
Including spurious facts about the Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherers and the so-called Cheddar Man, then skipping forward 8,000 years or so to allege Roman Emperor Septimus Severus was black when he wasn't, and then unable to come up with any accurate figures of varying consequence till the 1800s. Nevertheless, the video, as far as its impressionable young audience was concerned, had the effect of instilling the idea that Britain has always been multiracial and multicultural since ancient times, the kind of educational impulses of identity junkies. When it comes to colorblind casting, you can at least distinguish between the historical and the fantastic. The two realms bring up contrasting issues. In the fantasy genre, you might try to argue that colorblind casting isn't that big a deal, because there's no real reason why an elf or a Valerian couldn't be played by a non-white actor, other than genre convention. But this isn't really good enough for a number of reasons. Firstly, those who suggest fantasy shouldn't be taken that seriously probably haven't read Tolkien, don't understand how fantasy, at its best, is closely related to the foundational narratives of mythology and lore, and ancient archetypes, and their relation to collective psychology and identity, nor how such a genre, in terms of plotting and characterization and acting, can be upscaled to something quite sophisticated, as in House of the Dragon. Secondly, such people don't appreciate that even fantasy can abide by strict canon, and by extension have quite set structures, and yes, conventions about the aesthetics, look, and ethnicities of its characters. Just because it's a fantasy genre doesn't mean it ought to be cavalierly co-opted and used to promote cultural messaging by identity junkies. There's also the issue of diversity in the immediate sense, causing a reduction of diversity in the wider sense from show to show. As an author on Twitter noted, by putting these images from 4 contemporary fantasy shows together, you have a bland repetition and indistinguishability of one fantasy show from the next, because the abeyance to representation causes a wider uniformity, and this of course extends to the varying locales within each show. You have Asian, European, Black, and Hispanic people incongruously intermingled, whether the location is a mysterious, windswept, snowy expanse, or a sun-baked, scorching desert territory, or a lushly forested and verdant realm. Everywhere is everywhere, with everyone, and has the effect of making anywhere, nowhere in particular. If every place is constituted of every identity, then no place has any particular identity. This is especially important in fantasy, because the genre usually involves quests, and in modern-day fantasy shows, you have the sense of going nowhere. But this doesn't register with, least of all matter, to identity junkies. But what about fiction set not so much in our world, but in what passes for our world? Ryan Murphy's Netflix show Hollywood featured several real-life celebrities, directors, and agents in post-war Tinseltown, their biographies intentionally pumped full of lies to suit the series' alternate history, which imagines how life might have been different for queer, black, and brown entertainers if racism and homophobia were not barriers to their success. Actresses who didn't win Oscars do. Closeted actors are public about their sexuality. A sobering and poignant reflection on the iniquities of the past framed in an audaciously meta way? Not really, more a supercilious reverie that clumsily doesn't account for culture as a medium through which people form and express their identities, navigate prevailing attitudes, and which juxtaposes an enlightened modern perspective onto a historical one, which creates a world defined more by ambiguous dualities than by any sophisticated cohesion. It's the sort of premise that could only be dreamt up by identity junkies. There's the Paramount Plus original series Grease, Rise of the Pink Ladies, set at the mythical Rydell High School 4 years before the events of the film Grease. The first thing that strikes you about this prequel series is that the world of Rydell is decidedly more diverse than the school in the 1978 musical, largely because of the presence of Latino, Black, and Asian actors in major roles. In fact, a cheerleader, the blonde bombshell paradigm personified, dates Wally, an African-American football player, and no one in the show, set in 1954, bats an eye. This new approach to world building is omnipresent these days. Colorblind casting doesn't quite capture what's happening. The shows and films embracing this new approach to historical fiction and fantasy aren't so much ignoring the races of the actors they're casting, as redacting the existence of racism. The non-white characters in the Grease prequel know they aren't white and refer to it often. It's just that the world they're living in is not plagued by the same racial inequality we know, until the writers decide otherwise for the sake of drama. The same dynamics apply in Bridgerton, which is set in Regency Britain and features black and Asian actors playing nobles. Black characters are introduced in a seemingly egalitarian alternative reality, only to have that abruptly reversed when the show reveals there is racist sentiment after all. The showrunners want to present people of color as empowered, but also empower them to overcome bias, which means the characters are inhabiting a kind of socio-cultural multiverse. It's an absurd take on black history, says Stephen I. Martin, black British author and historian. It is set at a time when Britain was the largest trader in human lives on the planet. Slavery was central to the British economy. Martin accuses Bridgerton of inviting or fomenting the forgetting or overlooking of the realities of that period. What are the implications of this kind of soft revisionism? In the case of something like Bridgerton, I understand it gives people of color a chance to play roles usually denied them, and people of color fans of Jane Austen a chance to imagine themselves as the heroine. But this kind of utopian escapism risks coming to blur how things were with its simple imposition of fantasy equality on the past. You don't subvert racism by such candy-floss reimagining. It's weird and dubious, and takes indulgent liberties, and exudes an intellectually and creatively feeble approach to the past. It's the stuff of identity junkies. Queen Charlotte, the latest Bridgerton installment, hangs on a minuscule scrap of historical speculation, the theory that German-born Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz had African ancestry.
It was bollocks.
I know there are a lot of people who believe it's absolutely fact that she's from black Portuguese royalty, said the show's creator Shonda Rhimes. The idea that that would make her their first black royal was very interesting to me. Who are these lots of people? Almost certainly a small coterie of identity junkies. Queen Charlotte begins with the disclaimer that it is fiction inspired by fact, and that all liberties taken by the author are quite intentional. There turn out to be a shit ton of liberties. This prequel chronicles Charlotte's arranged marriage to George III in 1761, which blossoms into real love and ushers in a new era of racial unity in Britain. The Bridgerton extended universe has always taken a curious approach to race, but in Queen Charlotte it reaches bizarre levels. This parallel 18th century Britain contains many wealthy black people. These rich black Britons apparently went to Eton and Oxford. Charlotte and George's union prompts what is dubbed the Great Experiment, bestowing upper-class titles and acceptance upon those posh people of color, and thereby bridging Britain's racial divide. Racism is vanquished overnight, within the space of a dance to a string arrangement of an Alicia Keys track.
What, are you kidding me?
With one party, George tells Charlotte, we have created more change, stepped forward more than Britain has in the last century. It's a puerile, flaky load of bollocks, dreamt up by precious and talentless identity junkies. One awful symptom of this bland indulgence is that it seeps into the minds of people who begin to fail to differentiate between their on-screen fantasies and reality. Black British actor Adjoa Andoh, who plays Bridgerton's Lady Danbury, was invited by ITV to commentate on King Charles' coronation. Andoh described the lineup of waving royals on the Buckingham Palace balcony as terribly white. Andoh had lost sight of the yawning gap between fiction and fact. Shows such as Bridgerton have been applauded for introducing actors of color into the terribly white space of costume drama, but have now, in the minds of such feeble people, created some kind of fake retroactive sense that it is odd if there isn't diversity in the white, inbred cesspool of a gene pool that is the royal family, because they're identity junkies. According to The Advocate, director Leslie Headland is excited to be bringing her queer point of view to a galaxy far, far away. Headland is showrunning The Acolyte, one of the new Star Wars series introduced by Disney+. It is a mystery thriller that follows the emergence of dark side powers in the final days of the High Republic era, will be female-centric, and will be coming from Headland's queer point of view. There's just no way that me being a queer woman is not going to be reflected in my work. I could try not to do it, but why would I? Because if you'd had anything to do with the dreaming up, the grit and hard work to develop, or the perseverance and seeing through with of something breathtakingly original like Star Wars, then imbuing it with elements of your own identity might be okay. But taking an existing franchise you had no part in fostering and blithely infusing your sexual identity into it as a matter of course is lame and obnoxious and reflects a modern paradox where a focus on your own identity leads to a strange lack of self-awareness. This is the modern condition of the identity junkie. Mindy Kaling, discussing her decision to reimagine the character of Velma in her Scooby-Doo spin-off series, said, "The essence of Velma is not necessarily tied to her whiteness, and I identify so much as her character, and I think so many people do, so it's like, yeah, let's make her Indian in this series." After seeing how the animated South Asian version of Velma looked, the Mindy Project star stated, "It felt like it really kept to the heart of the show." Anything further from the simple, tongue-in-cheek, campy, and fun heart of the show, it would be hard to imagine, with Kaling not just reimagining it literally in her own image, but turning it into a cynical, dreary deconstruction or promotion of all types of identities. The likes of Kaling can't conceive that their reimagining is just a pleasant way of saying co-opting. That's because they're identity junkies. Months on from the Harry Potter video game Hogwarts Legacy facing, then easily brushing aside a boycott by opponents of J.K. Rowling, London Comic-Con cancelled a planned Harry Potter-themed panel from its event after an LGBT group claimed it would not be a safe and inclusive environment. Activists from the LGBT group Switchboard threatened to pull out of hosting the first Pride Lounge if the panel was allowed to partake in the event due to author J.K. Rowling's historical remarks concerning transgender people. All of this is the kind of prissy, flaky, lamentably fragile actions of identity junkies. And I express all of this not as a conservative, but as someone generally liberal, who was frustrated by the prissier, moralizing excesses of liberalism being treated too permissively by a pop culture media. Hollywood needs to rethink the attitude toward colorblind casting, because diversity and inclusivity are fine per se, but not in ways that are contextually incoherent, resulting in black Vikings or race-swapped actual historical characters. That's not progressive empowerment. That's indulgent, weird, and flaky relativism. There are innumerable untold stories of people of color from disparate regions of the world and from across all recorded time. Tell those stories. The stories of people of color don't always have to be incessantly framed as trials of otherness within Western societies. There are grand narratives to be told, of kingdoms and empires and tribes and explorers and pioneers and heroes and heroines that scarcely need white people alluded to at all. Those stories and characters don't need to be reimagined, just imagined.